Okay, so I am starting a new series here on my channel. It's a bit different from Sims. Everything is different than Sims, but it's something that I'm very passionate about. I've been into like movies and TV series for as long as I remember. I'm very much into like fan fiction and everything, and I will get to make one of these videos about the history of fan fiction and fan fiction in general because it's fun. I love fandom history, and I figured I'd start with Star Wars because Star Wars is pretty big and it's a very interesting topic because it's got a lot of lore and everything to it. I'm not gonna get into lore in this video because that is a very extensive thing and requires way more knowledge than I have, and I will admit that I'm not very much into that part of it, the part of fandom. I'm more into the illusions and history, real-time history about fiction and everything. So I do want to make that disclaimer, and I'm not saying that I know the most or a lot of things about Star Wars, about fandom in general. I'm just a very big enthusiast, so you might disagree with what I'm saying, and that's okay. But please be kind. I know that the Star Wars fandom has a lot of emotions surrounding it and a lot of different opinions, and that this is my opinion and what I find interesting about this. There are some things that are actual facts in this video, but at the end of the day, take what you want about these facts and make up your own mind. I'm not here to tell you how to think or how to feel about anything. I just want to talk about nerdy stuff like Star Wars. So this will be divided up into 4 parts. The first part will be a brief history and explanation of who George Lucas is. And then we're getting into allusions and real life history inspirations of the Star Wars story. And then we're going into modern controversies and the things happening there. And finally, we're going into a short conclusion part. George Lucas was born on May 14th, 1944. He wanted to be a race car driver, but when he was 18, he got into a pretty bad car wreck, and the only thing that saved him was that he was catapulted out of the car. The seatbelt snapped. So then he decided to go into other interests, didn't want to be a race car driver anymore. So he studied anthropology, sociology, literature, and he began shooting with an 8mm camera. He filmed car races while he was at school, so he was still very much interested in car races, and that was kind of thing that made him also discovered in a way. And he joined USC School of Cinematic Arts, and that was one of the first film schools that was started in the US. He tried joining the United States Air Force, but he was denied because he had a lot of speeding tickets. And then he was drafted for the army in Vietnam for the Vietnam War, but he was exempted because of his diabetes. So when he was a kid, he was very much into this comic called Flash Gordon, and he wanted to make that into a movie, but he was not granted the rights for it. So instead, he went on to creating this space adventure called Star Wars, which we all know how that was. So Star Wars was very inspired by samurai films. And when Star Wars became a success, he declined to negotiate for a higher writing fee, despite a lot of people advising him to ask for bigger writing fees. So instead, he asked for more licensing rights and for merchandising and such, which, probably has earned him quite a bit more money than a higher writing fee would have. It keeps on growing. Star Wars was released in limited theaters on May 25th, 1977, but became a blockbuster hit, and which led to a wider release. It became one of the highest grossing films of all times at the time, and then was nominated for it was nominated for 10 Oscars and won 7 of them, and was one of the first 25 films selected for preservation in the National Film Registry because it was culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. And its soundtrack was later added to the National Recording Registry. We're all familiar with the imagery of the Empire and the First Order that was inspired by the Nazis, from uniforms, helmets, set designs, and Hux's speech in The Force Awakens for all of these stormtroopers. There are people who don't see this illusion, but those people are few and far in between because it's the one that it's the most on the nose. And so it's pretty much fairly easy to agree upon in the Star Wars franchise that the First Order and the Empire is very much inspired by Nazi imagery and rhetorics. However, there is much more history behind the movies. Like the Ewoks were inspired by Vietnam rebels and their ability to best their opponents, but despite having despite their opponents having far more advanced weapons. And Lucas was quoted saying about the Star Wars and Vietnam War, a large technological empire going after a small group of freedom fighters. And do I have to say more? But then he was even more explicit and has said the emperor's name was Richard M. Nixon. End quote. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and became an imperial guy. And he was really evil, but he pretended to be a really nice guy. It was really about the Vietnam War. And that was the period where Nixon was trying to run for a second term, which got me thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships, because democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. This is something that's rarely talked about from the discussions that I've seen and participated in. Of course, there's quite a few articles about it out on the internet, so it might have just been that I haven't been privy to these discussions, but it's something that I've often had to bring up myself when talking about the First Order, specifically because I got into Star Wars a bit later than a lot of people did, so my first frame of reference is the First Order, but a lot of people try to just say that it's the Nazis and don't want to admit to that the First Order and the Empire can be the United States. And we can't forget the time period where the movies premiered, when the tensions were high and the Cold War was very real, with a global arms race and nuclear war hanging as a looming threat. And the Death Star is a clear allusion to the nuclear bomb, the nuclear everything. Movies are important creative outlets for our times, and the allusions and references made within them are keys to understand what preoccupies the thoughts of everyday people at the time, but also the psychology and attitudes towards these happenings. This is something that shines through all the eras of the Star Wars movies. It's a highly political movie. It has a very clear political commentary of what is going on during these times. And the sequel theory, for example, has allusions to resurrection of ethnocentric ideologies and increased radicalization of young men, and increasing loneliness of younger generations in a time where we are very much farther away from each other through internet, through, there's this discussion about in Japan about the increasing number of people who are virgins or never even consider having children, and relationships and all that, which I find is a very interesting topic. I don't know very much about it, but what I have read, again, I will be very transparent about the things that I am just briefly familiar with that I've probably just read headlines, But it also shows a stark contrast in its loss of idealism and faith in authorities and the blurring of lines of who the good guy and the bad guy is. For example, DJ in The Last Jedi. Without getting too into it, this is where my gripe with The Rise of Skywalker comes in. It becomes too focused with recreating the nostalgia that the original trilogy evokes, and restructuring the sequel on track to what J.J. Abrams wanted it to be, that it loses its footing in reflecting current times and becomes kind of irrelevant and hard to relate to. Well, I didn't hate it. It became too meta and wasn't its own movie with its own allusions and political commentary, which I think the Star Wars franchise is at its core. It became just entertainment, and sure, it entertained, but it didn't leave me with any thoughts or any feelings or any what could this mean. It was what it was, and that's it. And I like my media with depth, Star Wars has such depth that removing the political, psychological aspects of it makes the movie dull and unmemorable. Star Wars wouldn't have become the hit that it is today, or have the cultural significance for new and old generations if it didn't have these key things. There are many things that A New Hope did right. And I, of course, should not forget the set design and innovation in the creation of that movie. But as a storyteller myself, it's that I'm interested in the most. I like words, I like illusions, I like all of those things. But I also like politics. So it's kind of why that has stuck in my head the most. Star Wars has a race problem. Saying this shouldn't be controversial, it is fact. Actually, Hollywood, media, everywhere has a race problem. And by I mean there is a race problem, I mean they're ignoring it. Also, it kind of has a sexism problem as well. Let's talk about that. Bustle article sums the problem up quite nicely. The vast majority of roles are white men, and followed quite far behind is white women. Men of color get a sad excuse for a third place, and women of color? Well, even now that women are getting the main character place, roles in both the both in sequel trilogy and Rogue One, they're brown-haired and brown-eyed women. Hardly much diversity in that. And I say that as a white woman with brown hair and brown eyes. I'm what the majority of women everywhere looks like on media. There's barely a step up from white men. Occasionally I have gone through movie listings of current things that are at the cinema and see the percentages of white women, people of color in general, and women of color in proportion to white men and animated non-human characters. White men and non-human characters always won. This is obviously not very scientific experience, and I did no actual documentation of this, neither did I look at screen time or dialogue of these characters, but these statistics exist and they're shit in media overall, and Star Wars is no exception. There's plenty of statistics to find out there about this, and it's very damning evidence. This type of conversation has led to quite a bit of hate being spread within the Star Wars community, which kind of leads back to the allusions to the resurrection of ethnocentric ideologies and stuff. And sometimes, even when you spell it out to a person who is consuming the media in question, there is a lack of self-awareness. What I want to say is, you're not a Jedi, you're a stormtrooper. In a June 2018 article, CBS News talks about the dark side of the Star Wars fandom, meaning the racism within it. December the same year, an Esquire article writes that the Star Wars community has proven them right, that Star Wars fans has ruined Star Wars. The writer in this Esquire article talks about having been harassed, which is becoming an unfortunate reality for people within fandoms like Star Wars, where there is this purist mentality of how things should be and the expectation to those being catered to. People who oppose this or don't fit the ideal fandom that they've imagined, they get harassed. I say it says a lot that as I was preparing this, I was doubting whether or not I should actually post this or not. But I have hope that some of the worst tensions have died out and some maturity has been achieved. Alas, I'll just have to wait and see. When John Boyega first appeared in the teaser trailer, there was backlash. Racist, of course, and then ensuing sexism when Rey was announced. While plenty of people argue that the hate of Rey is justified due to her being a Mary Sue character, I've yet to find actual good arguments as to how she is a Mary Sue that cannot be countered with Kylo was mortally wounded and Rey has been fighting with the staff for her whole life, or it's a fantasy movie, Steven. Sit down. People try to counter that Mary Sue isn't a sexist label, However, I feel like it's far too liberally slung around without proper knowledge of its history and full meaning. Kind of like the appropriation of the Karen meme, which is made by black people for black people and bastardized into something completely different. But the counter argument that Gary Marty's do exist is dull and uninspired. When was the last time we saw a movie and we came out of the movie and said, oh god, that character was such a Marty Stew? Like, come on. It's a bad argument. We don't do that. Similarly, the very existence of black characters that have a storyline, a plot line in the movies was met with racist resistance. The arguments were something like they're filling a quota or whatever for diversity points. Honestly, I don't understand those arguments because I don't understand why having characters that don't look like me is a bad thing. And white men have significantly more characters out there looking like that and them, and they're the ones that are complaining. Is it strange then that the movie that caused such outrage was the movie that portrayed Kylo Ren as a radicalized white man manipulated by this omnipresent entity into believing this extreme ideology was for the better good? I don't think it's strange at all. While it may not have been a conscious resistance, I think it was uncomfortable for them. There are other reasons to dislike The Last Jedi, and though I loved it, I'm not going to paint everyone who disliked the movie as this far-right, racist, misogynic radical. What I mean here is that the people who are already radicalized or in the process of being radicalized will take any offense to any type of medium which calls a spade a spade. I also think the huge reason why the allusions to the Vietnam War and Emperor Palpatine being Nixon is often forgotten or ignored. Because while the resistance in the movies are whitewashed, they're all white people basically, the US being put on the same side as Nazis is kind of an imaging problem. The US is currently a hegemonic power, and whether or not we are currently transitioning into a dual hegemonic system or switching hegemonic powers is above my pay grade. But it exerts control over other countries. If you want to nerd out, you can look into trading agreements like under the WTO, like TRIPS and GATT, or if you want to look into all the stuff there is GATT and SAPs, which I find very interesting. That's kind of what I nerd out about. But it is undeniable that the US has a lot of control over other parts of the world, which, the Emperor and the Empire and the First Order are doing or attempting to do. So I don't think that's a very far-fetched allusion there. It does make sense that the US is viewed as this ominous superpower to the rest of the world. And as an outsider looking in, this allusion isn't surprising. But I bet it is for a lot of Americans. As a white man in America, if you're now told that you are right, that you are being pushed down and away, being told that you're wrong, not just that you're wrong, but that your feelings aren't valid, that's going to be a pretty strong blow and will lead to an explosive reaction. And I think that explains the review bombing that happened on Rotten Tomatoes, which happened for other movies as well, but it didn't do anything to discredit the actual movie, it just discredited the website. It wouldn't be a complete telling of the controversy in the Star Wars fandom if I didn't talk briefly at least about Reylo. And there are many strong feelings about Reylo on all sides of that. And for the sake of time and for the care I think that talking about that ship and shipping in general, I will do a separate video on shipping in fandoms and specifically about the female-centric parts of the fandom. And so look out for that. That's probably going to be the next video. I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do for the next video. I have plenty of ideas. Star Wars is a highly political movie with deep ties in current events and historical events. And much of the reactions to it are also tied to these political happenings. And it is impossible to understand or even discuss the movie or fandom without also discussing the political happenings surrounding the movies and the inspiration that takes. I believe that a large part of the current reaction to the new movies doesn't just lie in disappointment that the nostalgia couldn't be replicated, but also the resurrection of the radical right and the radicalization of men, of white men. Something that is also a part of the themes in the movies, both in Anakin and in Ben Solo. While this is a very generalized discussion of it, and I've generalized the people involved, I can't ignore that white women and the role white women have had in all of this, and also the part they've taken in the radicalization process, and also in the racist dogpiling online and the spread of such hatred and ideologies. I have definitely seen white women express racist point of views in signal boostings on Twitter or different platforms, but also by making the mistake of scrolling through the comments on John Boyega's and Kelly Marie Tran's Instagram and Twitter and all of that. And I should also mention that Kelly Marie Tran was pushed off of the platform by all of these hateful comments, and I want to make a brief mention of John Boyega and what happened earlier in the year. That is something that I also think I want to take part of in the Reylo discussion, because he did point out that Reylos were kind of responsible, whether you agree with that or not. He did. But there are attempts to remove politics from Star Wars, from the narrative, to keep it pure and keep it this thing that the fanboys remembered it being the safe place without any politics, but it never was that. Just because they don't remember it being political doesn't mean it wasn't political. If you're reluctant to agree with me, I suggest going back and watch a movie or 2 or 9 or yeah. But I want to end this with a quote by Rebecca Solnit. Politics is pervasive. Everything is political. And the choice to be apolitical is usually an endorsement of the status quo and the unexamined life. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, please leave a comment down below if you agree with me, if you don't agree with me, any type of discussion. I find this it's a very interesting topic to me, so if you also find it interesting, please comments below. You can also subscribe to me if you want to see more of this content, if you want to see more Sims content, because that's also something that I do. I also stream on Twitch at least 2 times a week, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And you can also follow me on Twitter. But like this if you liked it, and let me know what you think. I'm going to do more of this regardless of the reception, I think. But anyway, thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I hope you have a really good time wherever this is posted for your part of the world. I hope your weekend has been treating you alright. But anyway, bye.